The state be coordinated to the maximum extent with the comparable functions of the federal government, including its various departments and agencies, of other states and localities, and of private agencies of every type, providing for the most effective preparation and use of the nation's workforce, resources, and facilities for dealing with any emergency or disaster that may occur. Nevada Policy's Robert Fellner, author of the report, held no punches when describing the ways Governor Sisolak has misled the public and abused his emergency authority under NRS 414. One example includes the governor's false claim in Executive Order Number 35 that NRS 414.060 grants him the power to direct and control the movement of the general public. The actual text of the statute grants no such power to the governor, but instead merely states that the governor may cooperate with federal or state officials on emergency management issues affecting both the state and nation. A statute that merely authorized the governor to cooperate with other state and federal government agencies during an emergency does not permit Governor Sisolak to control the conduct of private citizens in their own homes, Nevada Policy Vice President Robert Fellner said. When read in their full context, it is clear that the emergency powers statutes are confined to those emergencies in which immediate action is required, such as military attacks from a foreign entity, natural disasters, and so forth. Needing to cooperate with the president or neighboring states about how to direct traffic and the movement of the general public makes sense during the kinds of emergencies contemplated by the Act, such as a missile attack or catastrophic natural disaster of some sort, Fellner said. The governor is simply wrong when he claims that this statute provides him with the authority to control the conduct of private citizens in their own home, according to Fellner. As the recipient of these emergency powers, it is unsurprising that Governor Sisolak has adopted the position that the Act provides him with a seemingly unlimited range of powers for an indefinite duration, based merely on his say-so, Fellner said. While a close review of the text and legislative history of the Act reveals this to be an utterly absurd claim, the Nevada Constitution forecloses the concept entirely. The framers of the Nevada Constitution were acutely aware of the folly of trusting government officials to restrain themselves, which is why they created a system of divided government, and expressly forbid any one person or body from possessing the power to both write and execute the law, Fellner added. Fellner ultimately included a three-pronged approach for reforming the Emergency Powers of the Governor Act. The original, authorizing legislation offering protection to Sisolak's ongoing, tyrannical rule. Item number 3 on Fellner's list of needed reforms segues nicely into our next section. Greater than return to table of contents. Clearly, the emergency powers provided to Governor Sisolak in NRS 414 contain one major omission, a time limit. This is perhaps the most efficient part of current NRS 414 law. That fact notwithstanding, when these flawed provisions were publicly acknowledged as the pandemic continued to spread into 2021, the majority party in the legislature showed no interest in reacquiring its legislative authority by reining in the governor's emergency powers. 3 specific pieces of legislation were introduced, each intended to restrict the governor's emergency powers to a certain duration in the absence of legislative consent. However, all 3 suffered swift legislative deaths. Assemblyman Jim Wheeler made the first legislative salvo in this battle. His bill draft request, BDR 3641, which sought to limit the duration of a state of emergency or declaration of disaster declared by the governor, was made on March 18, 2020, mere days after the governor invoked his one-man rule. That BDR ultimately generated Assembly Bill 93, which called for the automatic termination of a governor's emergency powers after 15 days, after which the legislature must approve by a simple resolution a measure to expressly allow its continuance. Unfortunately, both for the rule of law and the integrity of our public institutions, Wheeler's legislation, which garnered 13 additional sponsors and co-sponsors, was wholly ignored by his Democrat colleagues in the majority. Chairman Edgar Flores of the Assembly Government Affairs Committee wouldn't allow the merits of this bill to be debated publicly, refusing to give it even a single committee hearing. The bill succumbed to its death as the first deadline committee passage of the 2021 legislative session arrived on April 9th. Only weeks after Wheeler's BDR was submitted, Senator Keith Pickard followed up with a proposal of his own in the Senate, which would impose similar limits on the governor's emergency powers without legislative consent and/or authorization. Unlike Wheeler's Assembly Bill 93, Pickard's Senate Bill 88 proposed a more aggressive 2/3 vote requirement from the legislature to extend a governor's emergency powers. However, in a sense, Pickard's proposal was also less aggressive in that it allowed a governor to wield emergency powers for a longer duration, 30 days before being checked by the legislature.
Is that it?
There's more to this. Okay. Maybe that was just the first one. I think you can only do it in sections. There we go.
Reflecting this, most of the crucial reforms to bolster the quality of education provided in Nevada, opposed vigorously by teacher unions, in particular, never saw the light of day in committee. Nevada's K-12 education establishment has, for years, fulminated about its perceived lack of funding to justify its miserable student performance metrics. Needless to say, this ignores the entirety of evidence which indicates, quite convincingly, that per pupil spending is a rather worthless indicator of student achievement, with many comparable states, such as Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Florida ranking higher in academic performance. Indeed, as the adjacent scatter plot makes clear, per pupil spending correlates weakly with student performance. Nevada policy, of course, is fluent in this research and understands the dynamics at play. Simply spending more money is no guarantee of improved student learning. Other factors beyond per pupil spending, such as accountability reforms, performance-based evaluations, and educational choice programs, have been empirically proven to increase academic performance, as well as boost other important measures such as college enrollment, civic engagement, and parental and student satisfaction. Acknowledging this reality is paramount to improving the quality of education offered within the Silver State. As demonstrated by the chart below, generated by the Cato Institute, continuing to increase K-12 funding without structural reform will not markedly improve student achievement. That the taxpayer burden of public education has nearly tripled since the 1970s, while student performance has remained relatively flat, strongly suggests more public spending will not produce substantive results regarding student outcomes. Again, the inference to be drawn is clear: more money is asterisk not asterisk the answer to that which ails Nevada's K-12 system. Indeed, as Nevada policy has long opined, it is a lack of accountability, not funding, which keeps Nevada's K-12 government school monopoly floundering. Writing for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Nevada Policy's Robert Fellner recently opined, Nevada is projected to spend $10,197 per student this 2019-2020 school year, which reflects a near tripling in inflation-adjusted, per-pupil education spending since 1960. Sadly, this dramatic increase in spending has not translated to improved results. Nevada schools consistently ranked among the worst in the nation, with only 28% of 8th grade students ranked as proficient or better in both reading and math. Some blame this continued failure on allegedly insufficient funding and argue that things won't get better unless Nevadans agree to pay substantially higher taxes. But there is little evidence to support the claim that higher taxes and more spending will translate to better results. In fact, a recent study commissioned by the legislature found that the amount Nevada currently spends, including both state and local expenditures, is already sufficient to ensure all students can meet all state standards and requirements. Rather than seeking to burden Nevadans with a massive tax hike that is unlikely to boost performance, reformers should instead focus their efforts on addressing the root cause of the problem: the system's complete lack of accountability. Take, for example, the so-called evaluation systems used by the Clark County School District. More than 100 district schools have for years received failing grades from the state, including at least one school where an incomprehensible 99% of students are below grade level in math. Yet, in a twist that would make Orwell proud, school officials claim that the district hasn't had a single ineffective principal or administrator anywhere for at least the past 4 years. No bad principals in Clark County, evaluators say. Fellner's points are compelling and backed by the facts, especially when one understands how additional tax revenues for public K-12 have been historically spent. As reflected by the American Enterprise Institute's breakdown of per-pupil spending, the growth in non-teaching staff has far outpaced direct spending on teachers and students for decades. Is it any wonder that student performance has stagnated as districts have become increasingly top-heavy with administrators, the diversity bureaucracy, etc.? Moreover, calls for increased K-12 spending neglect the well-documented demand for more schooling options. Public support for school choice policies, wherein families can utilize public funds to find the best fitting educational environment for their children, has been both overwhelming and consistent for years. Parents have made it crystal clear they are desperate for choices. As the below chart indicates, overwhelmingly majorities across all demographical groups support the concept of school choice. Even more noteworthy, school choice policies are supported most by minority groups. Nationwide support for expanded school choice programs has only strengthened during the COVID-19 pandemic and the related school closures. Now more than ever, Nevada families are recognizing the myriad deficiencies of the state's one-size-fits-all government school monopoly and are begging lawmakers for help. Writing for the Las Vegas Review-Journal in August 2020, in the midst of pandemic restrictions and school closures, Fellner made the following observations. Imagine how much more manageable the current budget crisis would be if the legislature funded Nevada's Education Savings Account (ESA) program in 2017, rather than killing it at the request of the teachers' unions. ESAs would have provided parents with $5,700 to spend on any educational option of their choice, allowing all Nevadans, not merely the wealthy, to give their child an education tailored to their unique needs. And with Nevada currently spending over $10,000 per pupil to fund the public school system, ESAs would also generate significant taxpayer savings. Further, the budgetary flexibility of this approach would have allowed the legislature to make any necessary cuts in a manner that minimized their damage, rather than concentrating the harm on the most vulnerable, as was done here. When Nevadans were asked about ESAs in a 2019 poll by EdChoice, 73% of the more than 1,200 respondents favored such a plan. Of the parents who answered, 82% supported ESAs. The teachers' unions and other beneficiaries of the current monopoly system, however, fiercely oppose such changes, fearing that it would reduce the total number of dollars that flow to the public school system. While this objection may be true in the narrow sense, it also rests on the assumption that students should remain trapped in a school that doesn't work for them just so the public school system can collect more tax revenue. It's unlikely most parents share that view. Polling clearly suggests that parents across the nation agree. evident by a June 2021 poll conducted by Real Clear Opinion Research and as proudly proclaimed by the American Federation for Children, a nationwide leader in advancing educational choice. Support for school choice in America continues to soar. Polling more than 1,762 registered voters, a majority support school choice, 74% versus 16% opposed, while 10% are unsure. This is true across party lines, with 83% of Republicans, 69% of independents, and 70% of Democrats saying they strongly or somewhat support school choice. Emphasis added. Additionally, a majority of voters, 66%, say that some or all of the COVID funds the federal government set aside for K-12 education should be directed by parents. Most voters in both parties agree parents should direct all or some of the funding. These results represent a marked increase in support for school choice since similar polling was conducted in April 2020. Overall support has increased from 64% to 74%. Public school parent support has increased from 68% to 80%. Democrat support has increased from 59% to 70%. Emphasis added. That fact notwithstanding, the political leverage of organized labor guaranteed a swift death to virtually any legislation introduced for the purpose of expanding educational opportunities in Nevada. Second-term Assemblyman Gregory Hafen of Pahrump, for example, introduced Assembly Bill 242 to offer a lifeline to the scholarship recipients of Nevada's only private school choice program, the Nevada Educational Choice Scholarship Program, aka Opportunity Scholarships. First authorized in 2015, Opportunity Scholarships provide tax credit financed scholarships to lower income families, which can be used toward paying tuition at a private school of their choice. Though enrollment in the program is restricted by current law, of more than 500,000 K-12 students in the public school system, less than 3,000 students have been offered a scholarship. It's important to note that opportunity scholarships overwhelmingly benefit low-income, often minority families who would otherwise have no ability to escape the public schools for which they've been locally zoned. In fact, families are not even eligible for the program unless they earn less than 300% of the federal poverty line, as prescribed by the original authorizing legislation.
Where did they end? Well, I think the real deal is just that, education reform is getting ready to happen here in Nevada. Let me stop this share. So we'll see how far we go down this road.